The unique atmosphere of Foulness Island is a legacy of its isolation. Up to 50 years ago, the only way of getting on was by a hard road of mud running parallel to the shoreline from the nearest mainland and linking up with each of the island's headlands. The mud road was known as the Broomway, since it was marked by 300 tufts of broom, replaced annually with the financial help of the lord of the manor. It was an unpleasant journey, and it was not unusual to have to trudge through mud 6 to 12 inches deep. There were ferries, but even the approach from Burnham-on-Crouch necessitated a 4-mile walk along the sea wall, where it was possible to hail a watchboat whose duty it was to warn poachers off the oyster beds. The boatman would land you at the Foulness sea wall for 4pence, and from there it was a 2-mile trek to the nearest habitation across fields and ditches. For if the journey to and from Foulness was awkward, then it was equally difficult to move about the island itself. There were no roads, just tracks and the occasional bridge made up of 1 or 2 very slippery planks to span a creek. It's stark, sometimes rather wild on this 6,000-acre slab of land projecting into the North Sea. The islanders live a rich, healthy life, although their relation to the sea, both as servants and masters, is always in their minds. Landowners throughout the centuries have added to the island's acreage by reclaiming marshes, but floods have just as frequently undone the good work. The cost of sea wall repairs occurs in records as early as 1400, but even new work carried out in the early 1950s could not hold back the great wall of sea that brought the East Coast flood disaster of 1953. 2 islanders lost their lives as huge lengths of sea wall were swept away. Families were forced to take refuge in their upper stories. High winds and heavy seas kept rescue boats away. Telephone services broke down, and the BBC made a midnight broadcast to the island to keep its lights on as the lifeboat ventured out. Most of the cattle were driven to the centre of one of the island's hamlets, Church End, where the church stood like a successful canute. Only 100 animals perished in the disaster. More than 1,000 men were engaged to rebuild the wall, and life gradually returned to normal. The village bears no sign of flood damage today, although the present church, built in 1850 and dedicated to St Mary, does appear to tilt rather dramatically. An earlier rector wrote of the island, "The public houses are kept under due restriction, and innkeepers are not in the habit of suffering persons to tipple during the hours of divine service, or to profane the Sabbath." That was in 1822. Just as well, really, because the George and Dragon right next door must have been a constant temptation. Like the only other Foulness pub, the King's Head, it's state-owned, since the former War Department bought everything here except the church, school and rectory. Across the road, the island's newest acquisition, a smart village hall. Church End is lined with comfortable, plain-built, weatherboarded houses, which lie informally away from what must be one of the county's quietest roads. The authorities have nonetheless honoured their responsibility for road safety with the only zebra crossing for miles. You could pass the post office almost without noticing it, and certainly without understanding why some islanders call it the mill. The answer's easy. The post office used to be housed in the windmill, which had stood on the other side of the road since 1802. The bus links the island's 2 villages, and this is the other one, Court's End. Cyril Bird runs the village store, and he's also the church warden. His family is first mentioned in the island's church registers in 1801, when Edward Bird married Anne Clark. and Edward, in the first year of the 19th century, also kept a shop. Another section of the Bird family used to live at Priestwood, a pretty pink-washed house, beautifully restored to its 18th century glory by its present resident, Tom Burrows. The suffix wood in the name might sound odd, since trees are not common sights on Foulness. It's in fact a corruption of Worth, an ancient word meaning marsh. This then was the Priest's Marsh. Tom Burrows has two brothers also farming on the island. One of them, Frank Burrows, is at Rugwood, another 18th century property. Also a wood, Rugwood probably derived from Rye Marsh, and is first mentioned in the records in 1246. The Burrows' other farm is Key Farm, also known as Monk and Barnes, run by Fred Burrows. By comparison, the Burrows are newcomers to the island. Tom Belton is at least the 6th generation of his family to live on Foulness. Nayswick, first mentioned in the records in 1273. This was one of many farms on the island which at one time had to rely on an influx of agricultural labour at busy times of the farming year. The large bedrooms were used as dormitories for the men, and Benton, himself a farmer, had remarks to make on the costliness of this type of labour. The men, he wrote,
like their brothers on the mainland, are now more fastidious as to their diet. The dearness of labour is increased by the improvident habits of many, the employers not having sufficient control over them to prevent them spending their considerable time by drinking frequently in hay and other busy seasons.
Foulness today lags to no extent behind the mainland in its farming methods. Sowing and reaping are highly mechanised, and the high potential of its rich fertile soil is exploited to the full. Corn produced on the island has won prizes for its quality countrywide. Asked once why there was no doctor on the island, a resident replied, "Oh, we die of ourselves." But in fact, longevity is well known to Foulness. Life's unhurried, and the island's leisure pursuits depend on the surroundings and their initiative. Fishing has been a job of work, a way of getting food, and an enjoyable pastime for many centuries. It used to be done by kiddles or kettles, nets about 4 feet high, erected on the sand, which trapped fish in the movement of the tides. They are mentioned in the island's manorial records about 1420, when foreshore rights were owned by the Crown. One charge given at the time was 12 pence for one summer kiddle. Each kiddle had its own name, and some of the stranger titles, like Friday Elbow, Farthing Teeps, Knee Deep, and Martin's Pleat, were still in use when the island was sold to the government. As the entertainment here is natural, so is the food, and the inner man is well taken care of. than to sit outside a country pub with a beer in your hand and watch the world go past. But all weekends must pass, and the farm lorries come back into their own on Monday morning. And it's back to school as well. The children of Foulness had a school even before the days of Queen Victoria. In 1822, the rector wrote,
"A school is kept in this parish of a public nature for the instruction of poor children. The schoolmaster is a poor person and is not licensed. He is a man of good character and of sober conservation and behaviour, and he instructs the scholars in reading and writing, and, under the direction of the minister, teaches them the church."
The present school was built in 1846 for 140 children. Its average attendance then was about 60. Now, as the population has gradually declined over the years, the average is about half that. Cyril Bird shows us where a 17th century wooden church once stood between the present church and the road. It had a spire, and in the vestry beneath was a fireplace, the smoke from which found its way out through the steeple. It also had a band to accompany services consisting of a violin, cello and clarinet. There's one bell in the Foulness belfry, made in London in 1719. There might have been more were it not for Sir William Stafford, the brother-in-law of Anne Boleyn, who, according to an inventory of church goods, did take away the bells to maintain ye walls against ye sea. The tithes of Foulness and its manor were leased by the prior of Prittlewell Monastery to Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn, and Sir William, her second husband, succeeded her on her death 5 years later. The rector here, in Charles's time, was Robershobri Dove, who was accused of conformity and affection to the king's cause. He escaped the charges for the time being, but was eventually deprived of his living. The government started buying Foulness about 1920, and today both accesses, at Landwick from Great Wakering and through the Army Ranges from Shoebury, are guarded by military police. You need a pass to get on the island, and you mustn't stray from where it allows you to go. Foulness has been called the nearest thing to a police state in this country, but this angers the islanders. They find the Ministry of Defence generous and understanding landlords. The residents also thank the government for the hard road across the island. The laying of the road started in 1922, the year the War Department completed its purchase of the island. The islanders began to notice its advantages towards the end of that year, when Sunday papers were delivered for the first time on the day of publication. The road was open to the public in 1925, and brought daily post deliveries into being. By the following year, a weekly bus service was set up to and from Foulness. For its future, Foulness looks mostly to its few children. Will they feel their family's centuries-old ties with the island, or will it appear to lag behind their vision of up-to-date life? This, then, is Foulness. Flat, certainly, fog-bound occasionally, windswept sometimes, but always without pollution, without crime, without much noise, without crowds, without all those things that many places now have to accept as the normal accompaniments of everyday life. Foulness people still manage to live a full, rich and natural life alongside the Brent geese and hundreds of other birds, some of them rare, which gave the island its name so many centuries back.